Welcome back to the channel, guys. I'm Travis Sylvester, and today we are going to be talking about gaps. Stay tuned, you won't want to miss this one. Hey guys, so we've had a lot of requests on how we get perfect gaps on all the panels of the cars. So today we're going to dive deep on all of the details that goes into getting a perfect gap. Step one to gapping your body panels is going to be cleaning everything up on the edge that you are going to modify with a die grinder. You can use several different things to clean this edge. The reason that we like the die grinder with a stripper disc is because a stripper disc does not remove any metal material. It just strips whatever you have, whether it be primer, paint, in this case e-coat, off of the vehicle. And keep in mind this demonstration, I know it's on a stand, but we're going to give you guys some real life scenarios with what you would be dealing with this car all assembled. You need to make sure you have the entire car assembled front to back if it's going to affect that panel. Obviously on a truck, you don't need the bed, right? But if you're going to align everything, you need the fenders, you need the hood to make sure everything is the farthest forward that it's going to have to be. You don't want to jump into cutting and modifying and lengthening doors beforehand if you don't have to. Sometimes if you jump the gun, you'll shoot yourself in the foot in the very beginning and you create a whole bunch more work that you didn't need to do. Today's demonstration is going to be every step that you need to do to modify a door, and at the end of the day, you don't end up with thick door edges and you have perfect 3/16 gap or any other gap size that you prefer. I know that some cars are larger than others, and everything is typically depicted off of the front of our doors. So if the door opens, every door pivots differently. Maybe the door pivots inward, maybe the door pivots outward. And depending on your car, you want this to be as tight as you can and still allow for enough primer and paint for the door to open without touching. That gap size is typically what we like to make the rest of the car. Now the standard is 3/16. There are guys like Big Kid Block Tools that make these fancy little tools that are helpful. This is a machine flat tool. One side, this side is your gauge. Like I said, this is all ground 3/16, but if you look closely, you have a tall edge and a lower edge. These are sharp. These things will over time start to wear out on you. However, in the very beginning when you get these, they're great. What you're going to be doing is figure out what side you're going to modify. And how you would figure that out is if your fender that butts up to this door has a 90-degree edge, you can't just cut that and modify it because a lot of times you have an inner structure that's affected. Where a door edge makes more sense to either shorten or lengthen because it's just one flat edge. This is a auto metal direct door that we received for a different job we did in the past, and it was damaged in shipping, so we got to keep the door. I really do like to use auto metal direct. They have great customer service. Jason over there takes care of us on all the stuff that we typically need. But the one thing I want to show you guys before we actually start to cut and modify is with a straight edge that the door is nice and flat. Pay attention to this here. It's sitting completely flat against the ruler and there is no deviation anywhere in this panel. As you modify this door edge, whether you're lengthening or whether you're shortening, this is going to be shrinking. We often talk about what happens when you weld sheet metal. It heats up, it expands, and then when it cools off, it shrinks. Well, what happens, this would be like a kick shrinker. If you put this piece of sheet metal in here and you are shrinking this edge little by little, this thing will start to close. And the best way to think about that is this edge, as you put a spot here and you weld, everywhere you go, it is contracting those areas, okay? And as those areas come through and contract, it will pull this door in. And if you guys go to car shows or you're looking at one of your own cars and you're like, that's why that's thick. You might have everything metal finished on the door and in really good shape, and it might be thin throughout, but it's going to look and give you the perception that your car has a ton of body filler because you have gapped the car and you did not take one extra step to fix that. So today at the end of this demonstration, we will show you guys exactly what that demonstration is to be able to get that back perfectly flat. Now that you have everything set up for, this is Dykem blue layout fluid. You can get this virtually everywhere. You can even get it online, Amazon. And you just want to coat the edge of the door. Does not take a lot. And what you're going to be doing is, again, we're going to be using this as the demonstration to modify the door side because it is thin. So if you had the fender up here, you will be taking this tool. You guys can come up with whatever works for you to be able to scribe this, even if it means that you use one of those adjustable squares and you have a Sharpie and you come along it and mark it, whatever works. This tool just makes it fast and easy. So you're going to put the long side on the side that is not going to be modified. So the fender is not going to be modified. So you are going to be laying this tool in at an angle and you will be scribing. Oop, you don't want to be doing that. You will be scribing this entire edge. So this would be if the door gap was too tight, you would obviously be removing, and hopefully it shows up in the film that you can see where it has scribed the line. This is giving you a very perfect line and indication on where you're going to grind to. And once you get it ground, you will have a perfect 3/16 gap. At that point, you can flip it around to the other side, stick it in between your fender and door, and just check and make sure that it goes through smoothly. The one thing that you want to make sure when you're doing this is that the two different ways that you could be doing this is with a MIG welder and with a TIG welder. The big difference here is we're going to show you on a MIG because that's what the majority of you guys are going to be using, and I feel like people that have taken the extra step to use a TIG welder have a different understanding. If that's what you started with was a TIG welder, then great. You're going to get more penetration because what happens is this door skin is folded around and there's a lip on the back side. As you grind this, that lip will split. And you have to come back through and clamp this all back together and then start tack welding it. So we're going to jump right into, we're going to put 36 grit on our die grinder. The other thing would be grab a 3-inch disc with a smaller backing. That way you can use the disc to get into those tight jams and be able to wear it away, and this will flex a little bit more for you. It just helps with the fine tuning of the finesse. Now we're going to come through and very carefully we are going to be grinding this away. Right there, we have trimmed almost right up to the scribe line here. And you can hear that our inside piece is completely, flip this to the side, it's completely separated. And this is the lip that I'm referring to. You want everything to look as factory as you can once you're done. So the whole goal here is grind this down to your baseline line, and then you're going to have to come back through and clamp everything back together. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to tack weld this entire edge. If you don't have enough clamps, you can just move the clamp on through. But tack weld and move around to make sure that all of your tack welds are within 1/2 inch of each other. If you put a tack weld in the top and a tack weld in the bottom and you just start welding this, it will grow, and by the time you get to the end, you will have a big old thick gap of weld that you're going to have to try to recut and clamp it back together. At this point, we're going to use the MIG for this demonstration, and we want to make sure that our setting. Now, you guys are going to ask, because we did a demonstration on a welding video. If you guys haven't seen it, it's really good. I'm not going to go into the crazy details of what welder settings that we're on for this. You just need to be practicing, watch the other video, and have a hot enough setting that you're getting in and getting out, and you're cooling it as you go. Something that we're going to do here is some guys will stitch weld and they'll do 1 inch at a time and cool, 1 inch at a time and cool. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I want to show the difference on keeping your warpage down, especially with a MIG. You can do the same technique with a TIG welder if you would like, but the caveat here is a MIG welder has a harder weld, so when we actually at the end go to correct the shrink that's going to happen to this edge, a TIG welder is going to be much more forgiving. The weld will penetrate these two and the door structure much better and be way stronger. But there's nothing wrong with using a MIG as long as this heat is enough. If this is too cold and the weld is not penetrating, when you go to correct this edge at the end, it's going to crack on you and you will be welding this and super frustrated with back and forth on welding and grinding. I'm going to jump into, we're using a Blue Demon helmet. I'm only mentioning them. I don't get a kickback from them because recently we were using the, what was the other brand? We were using a different brand. I'll show you guys that one in a little bit. But for the price, for the bang of the buck, this helmet works really well. It has a lot bigger vision, so you can see much more. We put this thing at an angle so you guys can see. We showed you guys that this is a completely flat door, and we're going to weld this in 2 different styles. We are going to stitch weld, 1 spot weld at a time, connecting them as we go through, and then I'm going to stop once this is completely welded, and then we're going to spot weld again, same thing, 1/2 inch apart. However, we are going to weld them continuously down the entire edge and cool it as we go, maybe 1 inch at a time. The reason that we're doing it these 2 different ways is to show you guys how you can control the shrinkage and the heat affected zone with using the air and the welder, and show you how critical this is. Because if this is a very simple thing, whether you are just spotting this together and using air with every tack versus welding 1 inch at a time and cooling it too. You think you're being faster and more efficient, but you're creating more of a shrink and more of a turtle shell. Once we get everything done and ground, I will then put the straight edge back on there and show you guys how much more it affected the area with putting more heat. So what you want to be doing here is, well, at least this is, again, this isn't the only way, this is our way. I always like to steady my hand, and I'll use these clamps to sometimes, maybe I'll clamp this tighter, and sometimes you can use your fingers to help stabilize where you're going to be. Your hand that is not on the trigger should be using it to control each tick mark and where you're moving. It doesn't matter if you're grinding, cutting, anything, whatever tool, always be using 2 hands to control it. We are going to then be using this hand. I'm going to hold it loosely and I'm going to cool as I go. We will weld the first top section and then we'll come back for the second. And it helps when you have a ground. It's this shirt, I think. We have the top section all tack welded in, and you can see we've welded one tack about every ½ inch, so that way none of this can move and warp as you go through. And now we're going to go right through and one at a time connect all the welds overlapping slowly. With this top section, we have controlled the heat. Every tack weld, we cooled. I would say at a minimum, we do 1 tack weld, 2 tack weld, cool. Same thing, be robotic with it, keep the heat down. It only takes a few seconds to cool that weld each time. And now we're going to do this second half where once we tack it all in, I'm going to continually weld this down. A lot of guys will buzz through this fast, and at the end you will see how much of a difference this makes, and it's not that much of a time loss by cooling this one by one. Yes, is it faster to buzz all the way through? Absolutely, but you will see there is a substantial difference. So we're going to go through and tack this and show you guys. One thing I just want to show you guys as we go through this and talk about is when you are timing this weld, so that way you're not blowing the edge of the door apart, because if this gets too hot, you will, as soon as you go for the next tack too soon, you'll blow a big hole. The whole goal here is you throw a tack down, and with your helmet you can see the glow die out. You need to adjust with your other hand one small tick down to where you're stacking the weld on one another as you go through to make this a lot easier for yourself. As you watch the glow die out, you pull the trigger and zap it again. You watch the glow die out and you just keep doing that. If you just keep buzzing through, you're going to have a whole nother sort of problems. So just pay attention to the timing that we go through this. This one I'm going to be welding hotter on purpose and not taking as much time with the air. Now that we're completely welded from top to bottom in the area that would have been quote unquote tight, if you have a gap that you need to fill instead of remove, it's pretty much the same process, except you have to build the door edge up farther. There's 2 ways you can go about that. There's a few ways you can go about that, depending on how bad your gap is. One of which would be to continue welding, stacking these welds to build it out. Also keep in mind, as you weld this, you want this welder to be in line with your panel. If your welder is set in one way or the other, it's going to push the heat differently into the door. So we talk about it shrinking and making the door curl, or as I call it, turtle shell. When that happens, if your welder's out here, it's going to push the heat more inward instead of being in line, and it's going to curve it even more. So keep that in your back pocket to make sure your welder is in line. The other thing you can do, instead of just stacking the welds, because here's the thing, You're adding a whole bunch of heat if you just keep stacking welds, and things become brittle if you're using a MIG welder versus the TIG. However, if you take, this is stick welding rod, obviously you would have to put this on the ground and use a hammer and break off all of the flux to where all you are left with is the actual wire. You want to match this wire size with the thickness of your door. And at that point, you can bend this ever so slightly to match the door, and you can tack weld this as you go. Just keep in mind, as you go down, you are going to be left with a seam on the backside where you will have to come back in and weld. So it just depends on how big your gap is, because if you add a lot of weld, you're adding a lot of heat and a lot of shrink is going to happen. Same thing goes for this. If you have to weld two sides now to be able to make this look all factory, that's also going to create a bunch of heat. That's why using the air is going to be such a crucial thing on what we show you. The next steps that you're going to be taking is facing this MIG weld down carefully. And the reason that I say carefully is if you are grinding this too heavily flat, meaning you have your die grinder and you are not focusing on only grinding and facing the weld. Now, picture this is like a ball at the end versus the flat panel. You only want to be grinding on the weld. Do not be grinding and making the door thinner, because when we actually go back and correct how this has shrunk in, you are going to have a weak spot that will crack, and because you made it super thin through this bigger area, you're going to be stuck between a rock and a hard place trying to weld paper thin sheet metal. This sheet metal is already thin, so try to preserve everything that you can while you are removing material. This is a 36. You can use a grinding wheel, a flap disc, whatever you guys have more control over to just stay on the weld itself. And this is also why I always talk about two hands. If you have both hands on here, you have no control. When this thing grabs, it's going to go. So you want to be stabilizing everything that you use. As you start to see the little tiny bits touching the door, I quit with 36 grit at that point, and I will then switch to 80 grit to finesse this out. And then at the very end, you can either go back over this with the strip disc, you can use an 80 grit on the DA to be able to have a nice finish, so that way you can come back in and rescribe to clean up the very edge that is jagged. If this was on the vehicle, you have now added weld and it's jagged, right? You want to be able to come back in with the exact same gap tool that you started with. Remember, we removed the door to be a perfect gap, and now you just added a whole bunch of mountain ranges to one side, and this is probably not going to slide right back through. Every car gap is going to be a little bit different. However, if your fender is now super tight and you cannot fit this tall end all the way in, maybe you can get it down to about here and you hit an area of the MIG weld that you can't get through. That is also why we use the smaller backing plate with that 36 to be able to come in. And if you're close and you can see the gap is already close to there, use 80 grit. Don't jump into the 36 and then have to come back and weld it again. But if you just need to get into a tight area, you can then stick this die grinder in there with 80 and just face it enough to be able to get this tool in between your fender and your door. At that point, once you have it faced off a little bit to where you can run your gap tool through, you're then going to come back in with your layout fluid, and then you can come in. Obviously, this is so jagged, I can't just run this down and get a perfect edge. Now, the other thing you can do once you have faced this pretty close and then you have scribed it, now you have a line that you're going to go right back to. If you're just using a die grinder, its contact patch is very small and you will have small inconsistencies and waves in your body line. We are trying to get this as perfect as possible, so using a flat file coming through and facing this will also help you get a straighter profile. The other thing you're going to have to do, especially if it's the front edge of a door, is yes, you will have to remove the door to be able to grind down the inside weld instead of leaving this all boogery. Once you have completed going all the way around the door, depending on how much you have to gap or move, keep in mind of moldings. Make sure your molding still fits the length of the door, and be sure that as you move around and you have taken the hinge back off, you have marked your hinge to go right back in the exact same spot. We're talking about a very tight tolerance all the way around to be perfect. So one little off on the door not being perfect is going to throw this whole thing back to square one. So we'll face this for you guys just as a rough to show, and then we want to show how much of a difference we had with using air on not as much shrink versus a lot. If you guys are going to use a file, know that a file is not meant to go both directions. You're actually dulling the file when you're pulling it back to you, and when you're going forward, it's cutting. And when you come back, you should be off the door and pushing down. Otherwise, you'll go through files a lot quicker. Now, we want to use the old straight edge to show you guys what's really happened. We showed you guys in the very beginning this was perfectly flat. Up here we used air, and down here we did not. If you guys can see, I know this might be a big deal to most, but let me tell you, this is a small area, and if you were welding the entire thing all the way around, you would find that this would shrink in even more. If you guys are doing any kind of metal shaping, look how much better this is with controlling it with the air to keep your heat down little bits at a time. Your amount of shrink that happened is almost none, very, very minimal. But what if you're watching this video and you've already welded everything super hot? How do you correct that? Well, what you would do is use what they call a linear stretching hammer. A linear stretching hammer has a very narrow face that is rounded. Now what this is going to do, you're also going to be using a toe dolly with the flat edge, and you're going to be striking this. By striking this with the toe dolly in the front side, you can already see the profile when you're putting the flat side down, how it dips in. And then you're going to constantly want to be checking as you hammer and dolly to make sure that it is back to flat to correct what you've already done. This is the biggest caveat here is when you're MIG welding, we talked about in the beginning, it's harder. So if you don't have a good penetrated weld, you are going to crack it. Because what happens is you've taken away the majority of the weld. If it's not penetrated, as soon as you strike it with this, you're stretching it back out. And the way to think about this is, if everywhere you've taken this and you've shrunk it together, you are then smacking the backside of this door against the flat side, and what it's doing is it's re-stretching that edge to then come back out. Those of you who use a kick shrinker or a kick stretcher will understand this very, very quickly. Those of you who have not, this is just the way that it's going to go to correct what you've done. So we showed you how much it shrank in. We're going to put this dolly here. This is kind of awkward because I'm right-handed, hitting this with my left hand. After hammering and dollying this back out, it doesn't take a ton of work, but look how you can now create a very flat edge all the way through the door to the very end. What this is going to do is verifying with a long ruler, whether you're using a spline or anything, when you put this back on the car, taking the extra time to re-stretch all these edges back flat, you now will not have a thick edge, because when we're talking about going down the entire car with a straight edge, if this dips on this side, and let's just say you did welding on the quarter panel on the back side of the door, now that dips in, you have this valley where this car would look like 3 different panel sizes versus one mirrored finish. And that's what we really want to show you guys, how to get a car to a mirror finish all the way from front to back. So this is critical because you have the fronts of the doors, the fenders to the quarters, the trunk. Every single panel that you modify with a weld is going to dip in like this, regardless of whether you are TIG welding it or MIG welding it. So that is a good trick. If you guys are looking where to get one of these hammers, I got mine off of Instagram. The page is 20 by 20 Hot Rods. We'll have it in the link of the description. Now that we've showed you guys how to get your gaps close to perfect in metal, next week we're going to be showing you guys a real life scenario that we've come across, how to check your car for straightness, as well as how to dial in the bodywork of the gap itself. In the stage where you're actually skim coating the car and checking everything panel to panel, we're going to go through all the details to show you guys how to make that thing exactly 100% perfect gap all the way around the door. You guys will not want to miss next week's video. If you guys liked it, please share it with a friend. It helps us grow the channel. Continue to learn, share what you guys know. We'll see you guys next week.